The 1980s were an interesting decade for vampire movies. After the 70s dragged the mythology kicking and screaming into the modern age through films like Count Yorga, Blackula and Dracula 1970 AD, films like Phantasm introduced elements to the vampire mythos that would go on to be heavily prevalent from there on out. The 80s simply took these elements and just ran with them. Starting with movies like Fright Night, where the focus shifted away from the cinematic and moved more towards the postmodern. Horror movies in particular shifted in tone away from the techniques that had become steadfast in script writing, direction, cine and set designs over the previous 40 to 50 years, and the aim was shifted into looking more realistic and naturalistic than cinematic. Where once there were sprawling sets, catacombs and castles, now was substituted with modern suburbia and the average Joe. What modern audiences would probably identify as the Stranger Things look. I mean, I would call it looking like an 80s movie, but each to their own. Through the early 80s, emphasis was added to detail on set design. It wasn't enough for a set to look grand or have a sense of scale about it. No, detail was the key. The easiest example would be a bedroom. You need to be able to instantly identify what kind of character an actor is playing simply by seeing what posters are on their walls, what video games they're playing, what music they listen to. The onus was taken off telling you what a character was like through dialogue, and more through showing you via the items they owned, the cars they drove, or the clothes they wore. Wow, consumerism was a bit of a harder hit in the 80s than I remembered. Jeez. Anyway, popular examples would be movies like Fright Night, The Lost Boys and The Monster Squad. But for my money, I would say it was around the mid-80s that we reached the peak of this incarnation of the genre. As such, today we'll be looking at a movie that was released slap bang in the middle of the 1980s, and is arguably bordering on the so 80s it hurts side of things. Indeed, while I could have chosen to cover a more iconic movie to round this series off, the options that I had available were either missing elements of the 80s shine or were pretty much at the dying end of the era and weren't a good reflection of it overall. That, and because, being honest, while I could have covered Fright Night here, which would have been my other choice, I'm not going to because Fright Night bores the tits off me. I'll get round to that one separately in good time, but I wanted to talk about something interesting to see this series out that I was actually engaged in. So here's something quite a bit better. 1986's Vamp. I can't honestly say how well known or how unknown this movie is. I only really landed on it by chance when I jumped into an Arrow video sale, saw the DVD version of this was going for about £3 and chucked it on the pile on the off chance I'd like it. And I did. The film follows AJ and Keith, two frat initiates who decide to try and duck their frat pledges by promising their house that they can get a stripper or two to appear at the frat's opening house party at the start of the year. The frats agree to this, and so after an exhaustive trip through the phone book that bears no luck, the pair head over to their rich but dim associate Duncan's house. Duncan doesn't have any friends, but he does have a car and a lot of money. And in exchange for access to both, all he wants is to join the gang in looking for strippers and for them to be his best friend for a week or so. They're hesitant, but they agree. So the gang travel to a nearby city and by chance end up lost and a bit shaken in the rough side of town. Stopping off in a cafe to regroup and replan, they encounter a gang of albinos who don't take too kindly to new people walking around their streets. After a bit of argy-bargy, however, they manage to lose the gang and head to a nearby strip club. All seems to be heading in the right direction for the gents when things start getting a bit weird. For starters, a mysterious waitress introduces herself to Keith, exclaiming that they know each other, much to Keith's confusion as he doesn't recognise her at all, and equally AJ begins to schmooze the ladies of the strip club looking for the perfect one to take back to the frat house. It's here that we're introduced to Katrina, played quite fantastically by Grace Jones. Katrina is frankly jaw-dropping, and AJ immediately develops tunnel vision for her. After managing to wheedle his way backstage to a private meeting with her, it's revealed that she's a little bit more than just a stripper, much to AJ's immediate peril. And from there it's revealed that the entire strip club is in fact a nest for vampires and that Keith and Duncan are most definitely on the menu. Luckily, with the help of the waitress, the pair manage to escape, and so begins an epic battle to the death where Keith, Duncan and the waitress must fight the forces of evil, defeat Katrina, try to save AJ and be back to the frat house with a lovely lady by sunup. Oh, and also there's a bit of a B-plot where Keith tries to figure out who the waitress actually is and whether or not if she's a vampire too, though that plot line kind of fizzles out around the end of the second act. I would argue that this film sits on a bit of an axis for the vampire genre that existed within the 80s. Here we have a film that kind of embraces the John Hughes-esque self-ironic awareness that's renowned within 80s culture, but at the same time it's also looking forward to elements that would come to personify vampire movies of the late 80s and early 90s. There's a certain grisliness about this film, and it's determined to show you a character's personality through the cine and character's actions, rather than tell you it. There's a particular element of stylisation to this film, particularly from the second act onwards. The use of green and purple lighting on all the street and sewer sequences is a really nice touch, and the way in which the sets are lit add a nice level of shadowing to proceedings. The coloured lighting really makes some of the scenes pop and adds a greater feeling of depth and detail to the movie's direction and composition. Without it, I feel this film would have been distinctly lacking. Though equally, I also have to concede that just shoving a couple of coloured lights up in the external shots is a quite cheap and cheerful way to get instant stylisation. On the direction front, it's alright. It feels a bit like a John Hughes knockoff, particularly Weird Science and Ferris Bueller, but that isn't surprising really, as Weird Science had been out for about a year before this film's release, and Ferris Bueller was in production around the same time as this movie too. In fact, they only had a month's difference in terms of a release date. As a result, apart from the aforementioned lighting choices, while it is of a standard, I do feel that this film does somewhat fail to really establish itself in a unique way. Don't get me wrong, the horror scenes are well shot, if not a little bit too far and too few between. And when it goes for comedy, it lands it well. I just think this movie struggles a bit with its own identity. And no matter how many coloured lights and nice shadowy shots you capture, you're never really gonna get away from that. The Cine is much the same. It's most definitely of a high standard and there's a good mixture of shot types, pans and tracks throughout, but apart from one or two quite interesting looking sequences involving the vampires, it never really goes truly above and beyond in delivering something that blew me away. It's solid and very much a good representation of its time, but it wasn't the first movie to do what it did, and it certainly wasn't the last. The film was directed and co-written by Richard Wenk. Wenk hasn't really done much as a director. I'd say this was probably his best known directorial piece, and his last directed picture was in 2002. It was called Wishcraft. As a writer though, he's done absolutely tons, having contributed to the scripts for The Expendables 2, the remake of The Magnificent Seven, the Equalizer franchise, and most recently he's been drafted in to write for the new Marvel series Kraven the Hunter. In short, while he may not have an amazing directorial past, he's more than made up for it in a writing capacity in this century. Speaking of this movie's scriptwriters, this was also written by Donald P. Borchers. He's probably best known for having written, produced and directed the original Children of the Corn. Collectively, he only has 3 writing credits, and he's definitely more of a producer than a writer, but on that front he too has a pretty impressive CV, with credits including Highlander 2 and extensive work on the Leprechaun and Meatballs series. In that sense, this film kind of makes sense, because while the direction and cine are competent, it's the script that most draws me to this film. It's by no means perfect, but it definitely has an awareness about it. It has a lot of gallows humour in it. Some quite dark jokes are about, and it feels like the cast genuinely enjoyed sinking their teeth into this one. No pun intended. The dialogue is all quite fluid and naturalistic for the time. The plot itself is quite interesting, especially given that this was one of the first films to implement the idea of hordes of vampires hiding in plain sight, something that would later be used in movies like From Dusk Till Dawn and John Carpenter's Vampires. There are nice little ticks throughout the film, like AJ being weirdly obsessive about his clothes, or Duncan really trying to stress how good a friend he is to the guys who are basically just using him for his money and car. For the time, it's a unique twist on the genre, and when combined with the dialogue and pacing, it creates arguably the most enjoyable element of this film. While it is a touch predictable at times, I really got a kick out of this one. On the subject of the cast, they seemingly are having an absolute ball throughout this, with Grace Jones absolutely dominating every scene she's in as Katrina. She's absolutely mesmerising. Powerful and terrifying. I absolutely loved her performance, and I think the film would be a significantly poorer affair without her. Equally, Robert Russler and Chris Makepeace are good, solid main protagonists as AJ and Keith, bringing a sense of camaraderie and humour to proceedings that keep the film ticking over nicely with a pep in its step. This is some pretty solid casting all round, honestly. I can't think of a weak performance on display here. Everyone seemingly gets the tone, and everyone tries their best to get it down pat as much as possible. And it works for about 95% of the time, which, that's pretty good. I mean, it could be much, much worse. Finally, the soundtrack. It's good. I mean, it's not blow the doors off great, but it's solid, rocky and new wave pop-based fun, and I like rocky and new wave pop-based fun, so I like this. They use the music effectively throughout, nothing ever feels forced in, and everything kind of works the way it should, honestly. I wish I could be more constructive about it, but again, it's not terrible, it's not brilliant, it's just very much representative of the genre within this time frame, which in many ways makes it a good, solid representation of the genre. Vamp is by no means an original movie, but it's arguably the most representative of 80s vampire movies that I can think of. Not only does it carry with it all the elements of the vampire movies that have come before it, including full-blown references to the vampire mythology, lack of reflection, staking, the references to the ability to become a bat, but it's also beginning to encroach on styles and influences that would become much more prominent in the late 80s and early 90s. In short, you really won't find a more 80s vampire movie than Vamp. It's a good, solid, sturdy work with a reasonably original script and a steady hand on the direction, Cine, soundtrack, acting and lighting. I can certainly recommend it if you've watched all of the staples of the genre so far and are looking for something new that's off the beaten path. Beyond the 80s, vampire movies would begin to shift away from the self-aware macabre humour and postmodernism that was so defining of the decade. Through the 90s they would become darker, grittier, and return more to their roots of wanting to scare and shock audiences first and foremost, to effectively put the horror back into the genre while continuing to modernise and push forward the legend and legacy. But that isn't to say that Hollywood wouldn't stop at least a couple of times to look back at the original source material and see if anything could be done with it. Much like the monster itself, vampires are seemingly almost impossible to fully kill off. There'll always be someone out there with an interesting angle on them, ready to unleash a terror anew to an unexpecting audience. But that's a conversation for another time. Thank you so much for watching, and happy Halloween.